Hello everyone, welcome to the Houston Center interview series. My name is Zimmermann, Director of the Houston Center. Our topic today is human dignity and bioethics, and for this topic we're joined by Professor Gilbert Meilaender, where our discussion will focus on his work. Professor Meilaender is a research professor at Valparaiso University, where he held the Duesenberg Chair in Christian Ethics from 1996 to 2014. He's fellow of the Hastings Center, and he was a member of the US President's Bioethics Council from 2002 to 2009. And to make things more interesting, we're joined by two other guests. To Dr. Meilaender's left here is Quentin Genuis. He's an emergency physician at St. Paul's Hospital here in Vancouver, and he also teaches bioethics at Regent College. And then we have Professor Brent Waters, who was the Stead Professor of Social Ethics at Garrett Theological Seminary, now Professor Emeritus, and has written also a great deal on Christian theological ethics. So to begin, what we usually do is we ask our guest you've spent a lifetime on thinking about theological ethics.
Let's try not to think about that, how long that is. But.
So usually we're very interested in how you got to that topic, what influenced your thinking, what influential figures and ideas have shaped your work and your journey in theology, ethics, and bioethics.
I don't know how I got to it originally. I know that at least by the time I was in seminary, that was the part of theology that I was most interested in some ways. What exactly first got me there, I don't know. But it can be hard to say who were, there aren't a lot of, you can't think of a lot of Lutherans, and I'm a Lutheran, who made their reputation as ethicists. It's just not a lot of them. And certainly the person who I would say who most influenced me, obviously, was a Methodist, Paul Ramsey, who was one of my teachers in graduate school, but certainly the most well-known of my teachers. And Ramsey was just a powerful intellect and really influenced me a lot. There are other people, in terms of kind of living people with whom I interacted. This one may come as a surprise to you, but because he's not a theologian at all and not a Christian, Michael Walzer, who's a political theorist, was very influential. He taught although he wasn't actually on the Princeton faculty when I was in graduate school, he taught a graduate seminar at Princeton one year when I was there, and I took it, seminar on Hobbes. It was just a wonderful seminar, and I've read almost everything of his since then. I don't actually agree with him a lot of times, but he's just a sensitive thinker. There are others whose work influenced me, though I never knew them at all. Anders Nygren's Agape and Eros was a really important book for me at a certain time, even though I don't think it's correct finally, but a great book. Leon Kass had a good bit of influence on me, though Kass certainly wouldn't think of himself as a Christian theologian. And my wife, big influence on me. There was a period of time when we were first married that I never wrote anything or sent anything off that she didn't read first. And she sometimes found things I needed to attend to. Those are the people that come to mind first when I try to answer your question.
And were you always interested in what used to be called medical ethics or bioethics, or was that a development over time, and how did you become passionate about that?
Well, I never described myself as passionate. Everybody has to have a passion these days, but I don't. But no, I was not always, but in fact, I don't know that I was even thinking about it when I went off to graduate school. And there's been medical ethics around forever, but the field of bioethics was just really getting started when I went to grad school in 1972. But Paul Ramsey, who was one of my teachers, and who had written a good bit on the ethics of warfare, and that was really the Ramsey stuff that I knew when I went there. Ramsey was one of the early figures in the field of bioethics. He had just published his first big book, The Patient as Person, which is really still kind of a classic piece of work. And so I just sort of naturally gravitated toward it and began to pay more attention and read. When I started teaching, I taught a course in bioethics from the very beginning. It certainly had to be just the fact that Ramsey had been working on it that got me going, and I just kind of kept on from there once I started teaching.
I mean, the one element people may not know about you also are an avid reader of literature. So has your reading of lit influenced your thinking of ethics? Has it helped you in any way?
Well, I was talking with Brent about that the other day. I think if you look at the way I use literature in my writing, I use it as illustrative of different things. Which I mean to say, I think I have arrived at my views in other ways through more sort of normal theological and philosophical reading. And then I use literature to illustrate something or to make a point, something like that. So has it influenced me, or was I already influenced and then found some things that for one reason or another worked for me? I think it's more the latter. I don't generally read, I just read something I feel like reading. I don't read in order to use it in my writing, but then I sometimes end up using it.
You know, I was thinking of Martha Nussbaum taught a course once where she had students read Dickens novels and ethics to develop a certain sense of empathy or whatnot. Is that anything you...
No.
No. Okay.
Nor do I really think that's teaching ethics. Now, she would disagree, Stan Hauerwas would disagree, but ethics is a discipline. You need to acquire certain kinds of capacities and ability to make certain sorts of distinctions, and I think you need to learn the discipline, both theological and philosophical. Now, there's a lot of it I don't know, but that's where I start. So no, I mean, Martha Nussbaum's a great scholar, but I wouldn't operate that way myself.
Okay. I'm going to, well, thank you for that. I'll start us off with one of your main ideas, and then I'll shut up and let our other guests chime in. You lectured for us on your book, Neither Beast Nor God, and you made this important distinction there between, that's sort of the main, I felt, hinge of the book, between human dignity and dignity of the person, or personal dignity. I wonder if you could just briefly explain, why you make the distinction, what the distinction is, and why you found it helpful for ethics.
The easiest thing, I think, is to explain why I turn in this direction. Ever since I've been teaching ethics, or at least when I began, certain issues had just come to the fore in moral argument in the United States. The most obvious one of them was abortion at the time, but then some of the issues that became important in the abortion argument gravitated toward end-of-life questions, similar sorts of things, and always has to do with what we say about human subjects of one sort or another whose capacities are not developed particularly at all, or maybe were once but are no longer as developed. I mean, that was what the doctors would call the presenting issue, I guess. And so I taught about those questions and taught some of the important literature on it for quite a few years, trying to figure out how best to how best to avoid making sort of invidious distinctions between people whose capacities are quite greatly developed and others who have little or no such capacity. And dignity language has been used. I mean, I didn't invent dignity language. It's been used commonly in various circles. But I think there is a difference between what I call human dignity and what I call personal dignity. Human dignity has to do with the capacities that characterize human nature. And some of us simply have those capacities in more developed ways than others do. And it's impossible to avoid that. And if that's the only kind of dignity you can think about, then some people are going to come out on the short end regularly when we think about what we owe to human beings. But we also we think we're committed to a notion of equality in some way, some sort of equal dignity. And I call that personal dignity, that I don't think has gradations in it. And I mean, this would get to be more complicated, but basically I think that what I call human dignity has to do with the human nature that characterizes us, has to do with what we are, the kinds of beings we are, and we'll have greater or lesser degrees of those capacities. Personal dignity has to do not with what we are, not with our nature, but with our person, with who we are. And the notion of the person is a rather mysterious notion, not easy to spell out. I think, I won't try to make the argument here, but I think it's a notion that really comes out of Christian theology originally. Christians attempting to talk about Jesus in relation to God, and that it was for a long time an important and formative concept in our culture, maybe not so much any longer to our detriment. So that's what I took myself to be trying to do, to recapture a way, without denying the distinctions that are important in human life and that make a difference in many ways, without denying all that, to find a way to explain why we have this sort of unexplained commitment to equal personal dignity.
Maybe we can pass over to Quentin to see, have you found that distinction helpful in your practice in any way as an emergency physician?
Yeah, I found that distinction to be very helpful in engaging with patients with a variety of, as you say, presenting concerns, largely because I think, as Professor Meilaender has said in a number of places, that many of my colleagues and systems that I'm a part of purport to believe in equal dignity and the equal value of all persons, but can be very challenged to explain a rationale for that commitment. And so there is a language of the equal dignity, equal rights, a value of all persons, but then to explain and then build a thick moral space to articulate the rationale and then to work that out in the lives of various patients is very challenging. And I'm concerned in my own context about how that can lead to actions of disrespect to the value of our patients, especially persons who are very vulnerable or who are suffering in a variety of different ways. And so I think I see a lot of importance in articulating this notion of personal dignity that is immutable, that is attached to the person regardless of the condition where we find them. At the same time, I think this category of human dignity also makes sense of some of the things we intuitively mean when we talk about dignified actions that may vary according to the person at different ages and stages of life. One question that I had is just if you could help us connect the way those two concepts can help us at the end level of engaging with a patient. So picking up again the example of death and dying, let's say we have someone who's nearing the end of their life and as a result of a medical condition that's causing significant impairment, limitation, pain, suffering, disability. There's of course a lot of debate in our context around the language of dignity. What does death with dignity look like for that person and people who have very strongly opposing views on issues like euthanasia both pick up the language of dignity. So I was wondering if you could help us sort of apply the way that these personal dignity and human dignity distinctions help us in our view of that person, and then what we should say about good death for them.
You don't want much, do you? Well, the language of equal personal dignity, if we grant that it really exists, that there is something like that, means that whatever the state or condition of your patient may be, in the first place, you owe that person the best care that you can give. And in the second place, it's not your job to dispatch that person early from this life, even if, in many respects, it doesn't seem like much of a life to have any longer. That's what the language of equal personal dignity articulates and undergirds a certain kind of commitment, it seems to me. Now, the human dignity language that thinks about the differences in our capacities and so forth is certainly important. It may be that the capacities a patient once had are severely diminished, and although it's no part of your job to dispatch them early, it is a part of your job to care for them as best you can, and that will undoubtedly take different forms depending on kind of the condition that they're in, so that you have to pay attention to that, or you wouldn't be a very good doctor, finally. So I think in that way, it's important and necessary, so long as it doesn't undercut the basic commitment to the person's well-being. I don't know if that responds to what you asked.
Just change the subject for a moment. I mean, you were on the President's Council for Bioethics, and I mean, in my opinion, you actually produce literature that will be read. Most councils produce a report and it's quickly consigned to the archives. But what do you think will be the legacy of that, and was the experience worthwhile? Because you also took a lot of heat.
I used to say it depends on what day, when the council was going on, people would sometimes say, you know, do you enjoy it? Are you glad you're doing it? So I'd say, well, it just depends what day you ask me. I do believe it was a worthwhile thing to do. And by the way, although the language of dignity has a much longer history, the first report, the council was really formed in the first place to deal with the issue of embryonic stem cell research. That was what formed it, though the charge to the council was sufficiently broad that having dealt with that, we could do almost anything we wanted after that, and we did. But our first report was titled Human Cloning and Human Dignity. And I don't believe we were really thinking much about what exactly the word dignity meant in that context. It was just the title of the report. But that's when we caught a lot of flack. That's when Ruth Macklin and Peter Singer and so forth started attacking the dignity language as meaningless or worse. And so we were forced to think about it more, and we did some more work on dignity later after that. But I think the main contribution of the council was that it just did its work in a different way from the other national commissions. We did not think of ourselves as necessarily having to produce some kind of possible legislation. We thought of ourselves in more an educative role, and I think at least some of the council documents did find educational uses. I don't know how long you want me to talk about something, but I mean, I think this was fascinating that there was, for instance, a class, and I'm trying to recall for sure which college it was from, but it was actually a biology class, and the woman who was the teacher had her students tracking some of our work, and the discussions at the sessions would be posted online then. You could read the whole, if you really were a glutton for punishment, you could read the whole discussion. And her students read this stuff and so forth, and then each of them was assigned a particular member of the council to be, and then they would have discussions. But so the student had to try to articulate a position like that person would articulate. And then one time, after they'd done this for a while, she got funding for this somehow. She brought the whole class to one of our meetings. And so I got to meet the girl who was me in their discussions. I dare say you wouldn't have found any other National Bioethics Commission for which something like that was done. Now, long-term effect, I don't know. I mean, I think some of our reports will not be used that much, but some will. There's a report called Beyond Therapy that I just always laugh because it's a rather long document, rather philosophical in nature, without a single public policy proposal in it. Just how to think about these things. We also had the regular practice that the reports would be released when a majority of the commission voted to release them. It didn't mean that everybody approved, and they didn't always, but we had the practice that any member of the council who wished could just submit an appended statement at the end. And sometimes we might have, 10 appended statements. And I also got a kick out of it that in one appended statement, I was there, since I was kind of free entirely to express my own views in my appended statement, I articulated sort of a theological view about what we were talking about. And I just loved the fact that the US government was paying to publicize my theological position. So I think the council just modeled a different way of going about public bioethics. Some people liked it, some people didn't, but it was useful, I think.
Because as I recall, your first exercise was to look at Hawthorne's short story on the birthmark.
That's right. That was the very first thing, I mean, there were always a number of sessions at a meeting, but that was the first session of the first meeting was to talk about that. And I loved the fact that, and it was a good discussion as it turned out. It started a little slowly, as you might imagine. This group just getting to know each other suddenly asked to talk about this short story. But the council did catch a lot of criticism because it was seen, it was pointed by President Bush. Bush was known to have very serious reservations about embryonic stem cell research, so the bioethics community on the whole was hostile toward the very idea of our existing. And some people kind of mocked that, but my favorite example of it is there was in the New Yorker. The New Yorker for years has had these little talk of the town, these short little things at the start of an issue. And there was a piece in there, and I'm trying to remember the name of the person. I would like to name him, actually. He deserves to be named. But he talked about how weird it was that you would try to get bioethics insight from a piece of literature. And now my view was that's an arguable position. You can argue that may be true. It's just a strange position for the New Yorker, our leading literary magazine, to publish. But the hostility was great enough, that to do it. So I think we did good work. We did not always agree. In that way, we're unlike most other national commissions, which are established in order to agree. But I don't know long term. It's really hard to say what will result.
I mean, on the hostility front and so on, I'm just curious. So the Ethics Council is made up of people of different background, but certainly included you, a Lutheran theologian and bioethicist, include somebody like Leo Kass, the religious, with deep religious convictions. You said earlier that the dignity language is based on a Judeo-Christian tradition, the Imago Dei and so on. At least you refer to that also in your book. So to what extent, when you bring that, to what extent, I mean, everything depends on it in some way. How did you argue in the council? Just say, well, look, I'm from the Imago Dei tradition, here's what we say, take it or leave it. Or how did that work out? And I mean, Leon Gass is very biblical in many of his, convictions there. And how did that work with the other members of the council? And what happens when that tradition, which really supports the language in many ways, and which was voiced at the council, slowly disappears? And yet we want to talk about human dignity. I know these are kind of two questions, but I'm really curious in how you worked from your theological position and how that worked with others. Because some of the mockery of the council, right, came from, secularists who just thought that this whole religious thing was outrageous. And
of course, there were in the first place there were some perfectly secular people on the council, and I don't think that if you read the reports of the council, I don't think you would find obviously religious language in them. I mean, I could point to a few places where actually there probably is some going on, but not, I think, obviously so. So there was no attempt to do that. There was simply an attempt to try to kind of think through the questions. In terms of our discussions, people were allowed to voice whatever views they held. Now, sometimes on certain things, even if I think my view has religious roots, it'd be just kind of dumb to try to dump that on you if I know that it is not going to persuade you. I mean, what exactly is it gain? So sometimes that's the case. Though I do think at some point, how to put this, at some point we owe to others, whether fellow council members or fellow citizens, we owe an explanation of why we think what we think. They may think you're crazy. In fact, they do sometimes, but we owe that. We're very reluctant to give it these days because we just don't want to be criticized for that. But at some point, if you don't at least allow those things to percolate through your thinking, then you will always get a kind of preordained set of conclusions that has bracketed out some of the reasons that people actually care about this, and that I think is a mistake. But I mean, like Leon Gass yes, he's written on Genesis and Exodus and so forth, but he's also a very Aristotelian guy, a strange combination of interests, so that he can come into a discussion at that level in a way that wouldn't seem obviously religious in particular at all. And of course, there were some people on the council who weren't religious at all. But just take the embryonic stem cell research. I mean, even the breakdown on it wasn't necessarily always a breakdown between religious and non-religious people. It was more complicated than that.
One further question on the more complicated. You mentioned Aristotelianism. So how has the discipline of bioethics or thinking about bioethics been affected by exactly the loss of an Aristotelian metaphysics, right? That we participate in some kind of a natural order of things, that we need to respect that order as we think about human nature, our bodies, and so on. What's happened there? Clearly there's been a shift, there's been a loss of that sense in late modern, postmodern culture.
Yes, there has. Cass's first book, which was a collection of essays, and by my lights is still sort of Cass at his very best. I don't know if Leon would agree with that or not, was called Toward a More Natural Science. And of course, he is trained as a biochemist in biochemistry and as a physician. And originally, I think, thought of himself as trying to produce a kind of new Aristotelian approach, and did some other things along the way. But there are some wonderful essays in there that really try to develop that. I'm trying to think of other people in the field who work that way. And I'm sure there must be. I'm blanking a little bit. I mean, I think by far the larger number of people who have worked in bioethics, rather than working out of a system of thought, something like that, worked out of sort of modern Anglo-American philosophy, philosophical ethics. That was the real influence. Though the early people, though they weren't particularly Aristotelian, but Bill May, Seymour Siegel, Dan Callahan, these were people who had very deep humanistic interests, whether not particularly Aristotelian, but still embedded in a kind of deeper metaphysical framework. And a lot of that just dropped out then over the years.
Maybe, Quentin, we could shift to you to ask you whether you detect or sense effects of a loss of a more realist metaphysics in the practical days in and outs of medicine, of emergency medicine. And then maybe, Brent, if you could chime in after that on technology and bioethics along those lines, that'd be very interesting.
Yeah, so I was hired in my own health authority or health affiliate here in Vancouver a couple of years ago as a physician ethicist. So I have the privilege of being involved in the ethics team, and we do a mix of things. We do individual clinical consultations around particular cases, but also we do ethics consults for the organization to try to discuss the good. But it often does strike me that many of my colleagues on the team who are trained ethicists, most of whom are not people of faith themselves, when they talk about ethics, they have no concept of there being something that's called the good. And there's a lot of emphasis on mediating between different values or, relationships between concepts like autonomy and paternalism. But coming to the table, looking at a specific situation and saying, what do we perceive as the relevant goods that may exist in tension in this particular case or may be complicated? But even the asking of the question, what is the good? How do we pursue the good? Many people whose job title says ethicist find that kind of frame to be in itself a category mistake of some kind. And I think that's an area in my sort of day-to-day life and work that is evidence of this loss, not just of shared beliefs about what the good is, but a loss of faith in the idea that there is the real is the good in itself.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but it seems to me that the technology question comes in like almost every aspect of our late modern lives is because it's become untethered, that it really doesn't serve, all it serves now is a self-referential purpose. Mm-hmm. So that medicine becomes an end in it, not medicine so much, but health becomes an end in its own right, rather than as something which enables a different kind of purpose. Mm. And therefore, medicine now becomes more consumerist. You consume medical goods in order to maintain health, even though health itself can't really be defined to any greater purpose than good health. And I think the technology that's invaded so many of our aspects of life just reinforces that, but it really reinforces it in medicine. That, it's just amazing to me now that when you go into a doctor's office, the technology is ubiquitous, even in just the examination room. It's everywhere. And how often have I had interviews with doctors and never made eye contact mm-hmm. because the eyes are fixed on that screen. The screen is really the arbiter of who I am, almost, in a sense, as a patient. And then, you go into ICU or the operating room, and the technology is even more, and to the patient, terrifying in some respects, because you almost are at the mercy of these machines that you know little about, but you know that you need them to maintain the health. So I'm wondering, is there a way to tether technology, and particularly medical technology in particular, back to some other purpose, so that it doesn't just become a self-referential end in itself, Otherwise, it just seems to me it becomes almost an exercise in a perverse kind of nihilism. And it's not that I think people in the medical field are perverse. I think they're just caught up into a system which is bigger than them.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't so much a question, Gil, as it was just a
I'll let Gil think about that for a minute. I mean, as you well know, I mean, this is part of the larger question whether our thinking hasn't generally succumbed to sort of an ontology of technology that pushes us in a certain way, in the quantifiable, the calculable, the controllable, and so on.
Yeah, I think the mastery of nature and human nature is what drives it. And again, and sorry, Gil, I'm going to go back to George Grant here for a minute. I mean, it's not surprising to me that once you started with the abortion question, euthanasia soon followed. Because Grant had this line that used to irritate people, that because the slogan for justifying abortion early on was "every baby a wanted baby," and he said it will soon become every granny a wanted granny. So that the same kind of calculus takes in both ends of the human life cycle, it seems to me, and there's a certain symmetry to it which should be disturbing, because it's increasingly based on a kind of calculus as to what constitutes a life worth living, and who's going to make that decision.
I was going to say, I mean, I follow that, even though it comes from Grant. I follow it.
Okay,
It makes sense. It was where you started that I'm a little puzzled by. I mean, I don't have a problem with saying that health is the good at which medicine aims. I think the problem is that health is no longer the good at which medicine aims. It's satisfying patients' desires. Right. You're no longer in the service of the good of health. You're now a highly trained technician who can put your abilities in the service of their desires. That's where, I mean, that's not the only place, but that's a place where medicine has gone wrong, and we cannot easily reverse that once. Because we all think that way. I can sit here and say we shouldn't think of medicine as just in service of patients' desires. That's all very good until I'm the patient, and then maybe they better think about my desires. So I think it's going to be very difficult to reverse it. We got to that point because a medicine that understood itself properly, in my mind, in service of the good of health, was, you could push this criticism too far, but was pretty paternalistic in a lot of ways. And in response to that kind of paternalism, it was natural for patients to assert their desires for what they wanted, and properly so to some degree. That was one of the things that really got bioethics off the ground. And unfortunately, we've never really recovered from it, I'd say.
So if we can link that to the language of human dignity and the two positions, palliative care and euthanasia. I take it you say no to euthanasia, and yes to palliative care aimed at health that somehow includes the patient's desire. What went wrong? Why is it that euthanasia, especially in Canada, is definitely on the ascendancy? I mean, euthanasia is promoted, is pushed in the name of dignity, in the name of autonomy. So what has gone wrong in our thinking there?
Who am I to tell Canadians what? But in general, it's
in
not.
general, I don't think
just,
it's a Canadian problem, although we've just exacerbated it by our bureaucracy.
You're just in a leadership position in the world. That's all. Well, probably a lot of things have gone wrong, don't you think? We are accustomed to. We live in a world in which we're accustomed to being in charge as much as we can, at least once we become adults. And I can't be entirely critical of that. I like to be in charge, too, of my life. I like to be in charge of everybody's life, that'd be okay. But we give that up only with great reluctance, it seems to me. So that's one thing. That it has gone wrong, though, again, I don't know how to fix it. But of course, there are also financial issues. We had no idea what to do with escalating medical costs. And we do know, I don't remember the exact figures, but that a high percentage of medical expenditures, at least in the US, take place in the last year of a person's life. Mm-hmm. And if we could lop that year off sooner, we'd save a lot of money. So there are strong financial incentives. My hunch is, here I don't know for sure, but I think that there's a kind of, if you're a smart young physician, there's a kind of natural interest in practicing medicine in a sophisticated, technologically sophisticated way as you can. You may have gone to medical school idealistically hoping to serve the poor and underserved, but there's nothing wrong with becoming fascinated with what human beings can do in that. And that there's a kind of dynamic there that just pushes on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And pushing on is often good. You know, it enables things that are wonderful, but it doesn't always know when to stop.
Quentin, since you're a young and smart physician.
I don't know how smart, I was wondering if you could help us reflect on the language of autonomy a little bit, because I think we've talked about paternalism, we've talked about the reorienting medicine. Like I often, when I teach medical students and people about medical ethics, I give this basic teleological framework. If you want to know what's good for something, you need to know what it's for. If you want to know what's good for a physician, you need to know what a physician is for. And certainly in a Hippocratic long-standing tradition, there's this articulation that needs nuancing, but broadly speaking, what a physician is for is to produce health. And I think that we've seen, especially since the four principles theory of Tom Beauchamp and James Childress, this strong assertion of a principle of respect for personal autonomy. And we've seen a shift there away from the health paradigm towards an autonomy paradigm where what the physician is for is not primarily about producing health in individuals and maybe also in populations, but is more so around serving the desires of autonomous persons. I think many Christians I know very quickly respond to our present environment by lamenting autonomy and the autonomy principle and talking at great length about the harms of the strong autonomy principle. But I do think there are some good things to be recovered or preserved there. And as you've said, we don't want to be critics of autonomy who then are defenders of paternalism, because there is a good and rich way where the agency of the person is important and should be empowered by good medicine. But I was curious, are there things we should recover or preserve in the language of autonomy, or should we use different language to try to articulate the importance of, including the agency of the individual in care?
Well, it's a big question. Beauchamp and Childress's principles of biomedical